what life was like for a concubine in ancient China. Hey there, and welcome to Drowsy History. Tonight, we are going somewhere ancient, somewhere vast, and somewhere filled with silk and shadow in equal measure. We are stepping inside the walls of Imperial China, not into the grand throne rooms where emperors made decisions that shaped the fates of millions, but into the quieter, dimmer, more intimate spaces just beyond those halls. The inner quarters, the back palaces, the long winding corridors where women lived their entire lives behind walls they had not chosen, waiting for a summons that might never come, tending to appearances that had to remain perfect, navigating a world governed entirely by rank, ritual, and the quiet politics of survival. Tonight, we are going to follow the life of a concubine in ancient China. Not a famous one, not the ones who clawed their way to power and rewrote history with their ambition, just an ordinary one, the kind whose name history never bothered to preserve, the kind who woke before dawn, dressed in layers of careful beauty, and spent her days in a rhythm of waiting, service, and the careful management of everything she was allowed to feel. Before we ease gently into her world, if this kind of slow, quiet storytelling is something that helps you drift off at night, please consider subscribing to Drowsy History. It takes only a moment, and it helps the channel more than you might realize, and it means more evenings, just like this one, waiting for you whenever you need them. And when you wake up, or if you are still with me right now, please drop a soft comment letting me know where you are listening from tonight and what time it is where you are. There is something quietly lovely about imagining so many people scattered across so many time zones, all settling into the dark together, sharing these slow, calm hours. If your eyes are already growing heavy, that is perfectly all right. There is no quiz at the end of this, no pressure to follow every detail. Just let the words settle around you like the silk curtains of an ancient palace, soft, layered, cool against the skin. So take a slow breath, let your body sink a little deeper into wherever you are resting, and let us step together, very gently, through the gates of a world most history books barely pause to describe. To understand the life of a concubine in ancient China, you first have to understand the world she entered. It was not a world most women chose for themselves. In the vast majority of cases, the choice was made for them by their fathers, by their families, by the circumstances of their birth, or by the simple misfortune or fortune, depending on how you measure such things, of being beautiful in a time and place where beauty was currency. The institution of the concubine in China was ancient. It stretched back thousands of years, woven so deeply into the fabric of imperial society that it was considered not just normal, but necessary. An emperor needed heirs, many heirs, because in a world where childhood illness could claim a prince before he was old enough to walk, the continuation of the dynasty depended on numbers, and numbers required women, many women. More than one wife could practically provide. So the system existed, formalized, hierarchical, regulated. In many dynasties, it was written into law exactly how many concubines a man of a given rank was permitted to keep. An emperor might have hundreds, a nobleman far fewer. Even relatively modest officials of certain ranks were entitled to keep one or two. The concubine was not a shameful secret. She was an acknowledged reality, given a recognized place in the household, a defined role, a set of obligations, and a rank that governed almost every aspect of her daily existence. But acknowledgement was not the same as dignity, and a defined role was not the same as freedom. The path into the inner palace began differently for different women. Some were selected through the Imperial draft, a formal process that periodically swept through the population to identify suitable candidates for the emperor's household. Officials were sent to evaluate girls of the right age, usually somewhere between 13 and 16, assessing their appearance, their health, their family background, their deportment. Those chosen had very little say in the matter. Their families might feel pride, they might feel grief, they might feel both at once, because gaining a daughter in the palace was both an honor and a loss in the same breath. The girl herself would be taken, prepared, and delivered into a world where the doors closed behind her and did not open again. Others came as gifts. A nobleman presenting tribute to the emperor might offer a beautiful daughter or ward as part of that tribute. A defeated kingdom might send its women as part of the terms of submission. Some families, understanding the economics of imperial favor, deliberately positioned their daughters to be noticed, hoping that proximity to power might lift the entire family's fortunes alongside her own. Once inside, the transformation began immediately. The girl who entered was not the same girl who had existed before. She was given a new name in some cases, new clothes, new rules, new superiors, new sisters in the strange sense that she was now surrounded by dozens or hundreds of other women, all living in the same sprawling complex, all subject to the same hierarchies, all learning the same careful performance of submission and grace. The inner palace, in its grandest imperial form, was a city within a city. The Forbidden City in Beijing, which housed the imperial court from the early Ming dynasty onward, contained thousands of rooms spreading across nearly 200 acres. The emperor's women were housed in the rear sections, separated from the male world by walls, by gates, by the ever present eunuchs who served as the intermediaries between those two carefully divided halves of existence. She was inside. She was clothed and fed and housed in surroundings that were, by most standards of most people throughout history, extraordinarily beautiful. And she was, in almost every meaningful sense of the word, utterly without freedom. The world outside the walls continued. Seasons changed. Harvests happened. Wars were fought. Her family aged. But none of that touched her anymore. Not directly, not personally. Her world had contracted to these courtyards, these corridors, these carefully prescribed routines, and within those walls, everything depended on rank. Rank was everything in the inner palace. It was not an exaggeration to say that a concubine's rank determined nearly every detail of her daily life. It determined what she wore and the quality of the fabric. It determined how large her quarters were, how many servants attended her, what food was brought to her table, how many dishes she was permitted at a meal, what color of decoration was allowed in her rooms. It determined whether she walked or was carried in a palanquin. It determined who bowed to whom when two women passed in a corridor. It determined the order in which women were announced at formal gatherings. It determined, most crucially, the likelihood of being summoned by the emperor. The hierarchy varied somewhat across dynasties. China's history stretched across thousands of years and many ruling houses, and the precise titles and arrangements shifted with each one. But the essential structure remained recognizable across the centuries. At the very top sat the empress. She was the official wife, the one woman whose position was fundamentally different from all the others. She bore the title. She presided over the inner court. She had authority over all the other women in the palace, and her sons had the strongest claim to the succession. To become empress was to reach the summit of what a woman in imperial China could achieve within the system. But beneath her, the ranks descended in careful gradations. In many dynasties, these included titles roughly translating as imperial noble consort, consort, concubine, and then several further gradations below that, each step carrying its own regulations, its own allowances, its own social weight. The differences between these ranks might seem subtle from the outside, but inside the inner palace, the distance between one rank and the next could feel as vast as the distance between entirely different worlds. A woman newly entered into the palace might begin at the very lowest rank, little more than an attendant, with minimal staff, modest quarters, and almost no chance of attracting the emperor's personal notice from such a distance in the hierarchy. She might spend years at this level. She might spend her entire life there. To rise, she needed to be noticed. To be noticed, she needed to be summoned. And to be summoned, she needed to have come to the emperor's attention in the first place, through beauty, through talent, through the recommendation of someone already in favor, or simply through the random fortune of being in the right corridor at the right moment when imperial eyes happened to pass over her. If she was summoned and the emperor favored her, she might receive a gift of cloth or jewelry. If he favored her repeatedly, her rank might be elevated. If she became pregnant, her rank would almost certainly rise, because a potential heir was the most valuable thing any woman in the palace could offer. If she bore a son who survived, and if that son eventually became crown prince, her ascent could be spectacular. History recorded several women who entered the palace at the lowest ranks and ended their lives as Empress Dowager, the most powerful figures in the realm. But these were the exceptions, the stories history chose to preserve. For the vast majority of the women living behind those walls, the years passed not in dramatic ascent, but in the quiet, grinding, carefully managed repetition of daily existence at whatever rank they had reached, which for most was somewhere in the middle or lower portions of the hierarchy, comfortable enough to survive, elevated enough to have shed their former lives entirely, but far from the warmth of real imperial favor. The eunuchs who staffed the inner palace were a class unto themselves within this world, castrated men who could therefore safely move between the male and female worlds of the palace. They served as servants, administrators, gatekeepers, and often as the true power brokers of day-to-day palace life. A eunuch who controlled access to a particular corridor, or who managed the records of which women had been summoned and when, could make or break a concubine's prospects through nothing more than the careful management of information. Cultivating the right eunuchs was as important as cultivating favor with the emperor himself, and the eunuchs knew it. Below the eunuchs in terms of formal status, but ever present in the concubine's daily life, were the serving women, the maids and attendants, whose numbers varied according to their mistress's rank. A high consort might command a staff of a dozen or more. A low ranking concubine might have only one or two. These women dressed her, did her hair, carried her things, ran her errands, kept her rooms, and served as her primary human company through the long days when there was nowhere to go and nothing to do but wait. In a world this enclosed, this carefully stratified relationships were everything. Alliances formed between concubines of compatible interests. Rivalries simmered between the competing for the same resources, the same favor, the same sliver of the emperor's attention. Information was currency. A whispered rumor passed in the right direction could advance someone's prospects. The same rumor passed in the wrong direction could destroy them. This was the world she woke up in every morning, a world of silk and hierarchy and politics, so fine grained and so relentless that simply navigating it from dawn to dusk required a form of intelligence and vigilance that left very little room for anything as simple as rest. The day in the inner palace did not begin with leisure. It began early, earlier than most people outside those walls would have considered reasonable. Before the sun had fully cleared the horizon, before the light had shifted from gray to gold over the rooftops of the Forbidden City, the serving women were already moving quietly through the concubines' rooms, preparing what the day required. The concubine herself would be roused gently, not by an alarm, not by the cold the way a peasant in the fields might be jolted awake by the bite of the morning air, but by the soft presence of her maids moving around her, the quiet sounds of water being poured into basins, the rustling of garments being laid out, the faint scent of incense beginning to drift through the room as the morning ritual commenced. Sleep in the inner palace was a complicated thing. The beds were beautiful, lacquered wooden frames draped with fine curtains, the mattresses stuffed with silk floss, the coverings heavy and embroidered by the standards of almost anyone else alive in that century, anywhere in the world. These sleeping arrangements were luxurious beyond imagination, and yet many women in the inner palace struggled to sleep well. The anxiety of the environment did not leave simply because the candles were extinguished. The mind continued working in the dark, turning over the day's small events, the look that one rival had given her across the courtyard, the rumor her maid had passed along about which woman had been summoned last night, the calculation of what it all meant and what the appropriate response might be. Sleep came, but it was rarely the deep, uncomplicated rest of someone with nothing particular at stake. Rising was the beginning of a performance that would not end until she returned to bed that evening. From the moment she sat up, every element of her presentation required careful management. The stakes were real. A concubine who allowed her appearance to slip, who was seen in the corridors with her hair undressed or her robes less than perfectly arranged, risked something she could not afford to risk. Reputation in the inner palace was fragile. Appearances were everything, not in the shallow sense, but in the deepest possible sense, because appearance was the primary tool she had. The morning ritual of dressing took a long time. It was not meant to be quick. It was a process, almost ceremonial in its deliberateness, and it began with the face. Skincare in the Tang and Song dynasties and beyond was a sophisticated art. Rice water was used to cleanse, believed to brighten and smooth the skin over time. Certain pastes made from ground pearls or herbal preparations were applied to treat blemishes or maintain an even tone. The ideal complexion was pale, luminously so, because pale skin signaled that a woman had not labored outdoors, that she was delicate, protected, of a higher station. Achieving and maintaining that paleness was an active project requiring daily attention. After the face was cleansed and prepared, the cosmetics were applied. Foundation powder, sometimes made from lead based compounds that were beautiful and quietly toxic over years of use, was smoothed across the skin until the complexion appeared perfectly even. Cheeks were rouged in careful circles. The lips were painted in styles that changed with the dynasties, sometimes in small, precise shapes meant to convey delicacy, the dot of red on a pale face as deliberate as brushwork on silk. The eyebrows were shaped and painted, sometimes shaved and redrawn in fashions that varied widely across different eras, arched and thin in some periods, feathered and dramatic in others. In the Tang dynasty, yellow pigment applied to the forehead was fashionable. In other eras, small painted designs called floral ornaments decorated the temples or the center of the forehead. This was not vanity in the simple sense. This was survival. A woman who attracted the emperor's eye had a path forward. A woman who did not had nothing but the slow passage of time in increasingly small rooms. The hair came next. And in Imperial China, hair was its own entire art form. Women grew their hair very long, and the styles in which it was dressed were elaborate, requiring skill that took the serving women years to develop. Combs of jade and gold, hairpins of carved ivory, ornaments of kingfisher featherwork in vivid blues and greens, flowers of silk or precious stones. All of these were worked into the hair with patient precision. The finished style might take an hour. For high-ranking consorts on formal occasions, it might take considerably longer. And once done, it had to last. A woman could not simply redo her hair on a whim during the day. She had to move carefully, sleep carefully, exist carefully within the architecture of her own appearance. Then came the robes, silk, always silk for a woman of any rank in the palace. The quality, color, and embroidery of the silk varied with rank, but the material itself was constant. Layers were worn, an inner robe, an outer robe, sometimes a third layer over that, each one falling in careful lines, each one belted and arranged according to the standards appropriate to the day and the occasion. Shoes of embroidered silk completed the ensemble, tiny and precise, designed for the short, controlled steps appropriate to a woman of her station. By the time the dressing was complete, the morning had already consumed a significant portion of its early hours, and the day had not yet truly begun. Once dressed and presented, the concubine would take her morning meal. Food in the inner palace was one of the most visible expressions of rank. The number of dishes served at a meal was regulated according to status. An emperor might eat from dozens of dishes at a single sitting, each one prepared by specialized cooks whose entire expertise was devoted to a narrow culinary domain. High ranking consorts received fewer dishes, but still ate with a formality and abundance that far exceeded anything available to ordinary people. Lower ranking concubines ate more simply, though still in conditions that most of the population would have found remarkable. The morning meal was typically lighter: rice porridge, called congee, seasoned with preserved vegetables, a little salted fish, perhaps some pickled plum. Tea was served, and the quality of the tea, the delicacy of the porcelain it came in, was itself another expression of station, simple pleasures, but surrounded by all the formality that the palace brought to even its simplest moments. After the morning meal came the first obligations of the day, and these obligations varied enormously depending on rank and on what the current political climate of the inner court required. For women of higher rank, there were formal duties associated with the management of the inner court. The empress oversaw all of this, but her senior consorts assisted with administrative responsibilities, presiding over certain ceremonies, managing the allocation of resources, reviewing requests from lower ranking women. These were real responsibilities that required literacy, intelligence, and a careful command of palace protocol. A high ranking consort who handled these duties well demonstrated the kind of competence that earned genuine respect within the court. For women of middle rank, the morning might involve paying formal respects. This meant visiting the empress or visiting the emperor's mother if she was resident, and presenting oneself with appropriate ceremony. These visits were not casual. They required correct dress, correct demeanor, correct words spoken at correct moments. Getting any element wrong was noticed. Getting it consistently right built a reputation for propriety that was worth cultivating. For lower ranking women, the morning might offer somewhat more personal time. But personal time in the inner palace was not what that phrase suggests in a modern context. It did not mean freedom. It meant time spent within her quarters, or in the small courtyard immediately adjacent to them, with her maids, filling the hours with whatever activities were available to her. And this brings us to something central about the concubine's daily life. The hours were long, there were many of them, and they had to be filled. The activities available to women of the inner palace were numerous but bounded. Music was one of the primary accomplishments expected of a well-bred woman and actively cultivated within the palace. The kin, a stringed instrument of great antiquity and cultural prestige, was practiced seriously. The pipa, a lute-like instrument with a rounder body and a brighter sound, was also common. The sounds of the instruments drifting from private quarters and small practice rooms were a constant element of the palace soundscape, heard through doorways and across courtyards. The slow, meditative music of women spending their hours in pursuit of the grace that might someday attract a favorable eye. Calligraphy was another. Writing in Imperial China was not merely functional. It was an art with aesthetic dimensions as complex as painting. The quality of a person's brushwork revealed character, cultivation, inner discipline. Women of the inner palace practiced it seriously. Hours spent at the low writing table with its inkstone and silk paper, working through the forms of classical characters, developing the control of breath and wrist and pressure that produce beautiful line. Some women became genuinely accomplished calligraphers whose work was appreciated on its own terms beyond its role as an accomplishment. Painting was related, landscapes in ink wash, birds and flowers rendered in careful color. These were standard subjects for palace women. The meditative slowness of the process suited the long, quiet hours available. A good painting might be sent as a gift, might attract comment, might reach the emperor himself if the gifting was managed carefully. Embroidery filled many hours as well, silk thread on silk ground, the tiny careful stitches building up images of phoenix and peony, and mountain and cloud, work that required both skilled hands and a steady, patient mind. Fine embroidery produced within the inner palace was of extraordinary quality, the skill of the women who created it rivaling that of professional craftspeople outside the walls. Poetry was read and written. The classical tradition was rich, deep, available in texts that educated women had studied before entering the palace. Some concubines were themselves serious poets whose works circulated among those who valued literature. In certain periods and at certain courts, a woman's literary accomplishment could be as attractive as her physical beauty. And then there was chess. Go, the ancient strategy game, was played quietly between women in their quarters, a game of such depth that it could absorb the mind for hours without ever offering the same position twice. These activities were not merely ways to pass the time, they were the content of a life constrained within walls. They were what intellectual and creative life looked like for a woman in this position, and within those constraints, some women found genuine meaning, genuine expression, genuine skill that they took pride in and that gave them something to build. But it would be dishonest to paint only that picture, because alongside the music and the calligraphy and the quiet tea, there was the waiting, the interminable, formless waiting that was the true texture of daily life for most women in the inner palace. Waiting for a summons, waiting for news, waiting for some small shift in the hierarchy that might change things, waiting for time itself to pass. Waiting was the central occupation of life in the inner palace, and it was not a passive thing. It was active, exhausting, politically demanding waiting that required as much intelligence as any of the more visible activities of the day. The mechanics of the summons were carefully managed. In many dynasties, the process was formal and ritualized. A wooden tablet or a jade slip bearing a concubine's name might be presented to the emperor before the evening meal, allowing him to indicate which woman he wished to spend the night with by turning the slip face down. The chosen woman would then be prepared and brought to the imperial bedchamber, sometimes in a robe that could be slipped entirely off her body, so she arrived in complete submission before the emperor, a practice that varied across dynasties, but reflected the underlying reality of her position regardless of the specific ceremony involved. A woman who was regularly summoned occupied a fundamentally different psychological space from one who was not. The regular summons meant relevance. It meant a continued place in the calculations of the court. It meant the possibility of pregnancy. It meant resources, better rooms, more servants, elevated rank. It meant something to look forward to, something that broke the repetition of the days with moments of consequence. A woman who was not summoned lived in a different kind of time, Days passed unmarked. Seasons changed beyond the walls she could not leave. The routines repeated themselves with the quiet cruelty of sameness. She might go months or years without the emperor having occasion to think of her at all. In the largest imperial harems, this was simply the mathematics of the situation. An emperor with hundreds of women in his inner court could not summon them all with any regularity. For many women, the night of their initial presentation was the closest they ever came to him again. This was the quiet tragedy at the heart of the system. Women brought inside, required to abandon their former lives entirely, and then left largely alone in beautiful rooms with nothing to show for it except the years passing. The Tang poet Bai Juyi wrote about palace women with a sympathy unusual for his time, describing women who had grown old behind the palace walls, who still knew the latest court fashions, but had not been summoned in so long that the relevance of that knowledge had become painful rather than useful. To combat this, to maintain the possibility of being noticed, concubines employed every tool available to them. Strategic placement was one, knowing which routes the emperor walked in the morning, which gardens he preferred to pass through, which performances or rituals he attended regularly, and finding legitimate reasons to be present in those spaces required careful management of information and the cultivation of the eunuchs who controlled access to those spaces. Gifts were another tool. The embroidery that absorbed so many quiet hours had a practical purpose beyond the meditative. A beautifully made item sent with correct formality as a gift, presented at the right moment, reminded the emperor of a woman's existence and demonstrated her accomplishment at the same time. A poem composed with particular cleverness on the occasion of a festival, presented through the appropriate channels, could do the same. Food was sometimes used. A woman skilled in the kitchen arts might prepare something or have it prepared that found its way to the emperor's table with a note attached. The intimacy of food, the warmth of it, could create a small personal connection across the vast formal distance of the imperial court. Children who were already present in the inner palace from previous summons were themselves tools in this sense, their existence a constant reminder of a specific woman's relevance to the dynasty's future. A woman with a living son navigated the inner palace with a different kind of weight beneath her feet than a woman without one. And then there was the coalition work, the relationships with other women, the careful management of who was friend and who was rival and who might be both depending on the day. Two concubines at similar ranks might cooperate to ensure that a third who threatened them both received slightly less favorable positioning in the morning lineup for a formal ceremony. Or they might share information about which eunuch was most reliably bribable, or which serving woman in a rival's household might be encouraged to let useful things slip. None of this was glamorous. None of it appeared in the formal histories that recorded the deeds of emperors and prime ministers. It was the daily texture of a circumscribed world doing what any world does, generating its own internal politics, its own economies of favor and information, its own small victories and quiet defeats. And through all of it, the hours passed. Morning stretched into afternoon. Afternoon softened into early evening. The light shifted across the courtyard tiles. The sound of distant music drifted from another woman's quarters. A maid brought another cup of tea. The day continued at its slow, careful pace, neither rushing nor pausing, simply moving forward in the way that days do when there is nothing powerful enough to stop them. The middle hours of the day had a different quality from the morning. The formal obligations had been discharged. The morning rounds of visits and duties were done. The afternoon opened into something longer and less defined, the hours between the active morning and the purposeful evening, and how a woman filled those hours said something about who she was and what kind of inner life she had managed to cultivate within these walls. For many concubines, the afternoon was the time most genuinely their own, not free in any real sense, because freedom as an absolute did not exist here, but the afternoon could hold a quality of relative looseness. The supervisory pressure of formal ritual was lower. The eunuchs who reported on behavior were still present, but less focused. The empress and senior consorts were occupied with their own affairs. Gardens were one of the true pleasures available in the inner palace, and the gardens of Imperial China were extraordinary. They were not gardens in the European formal sense of geometric hedges and symmetrical beds, but rather carefully composed landscapes meant to evoke the natural world within a controlled space. Rocks were placed to suggest mountains. Water moved through channels and pools to suggest rivers and lakes. Trees were selected and shaped over decades. Pavilions were positioned to offer the best view of a particular rock face or the reflection of a particular moon. These gardens were the work of aesthetic sensibility applied over generations, and they were genuinely beautiful. Walking in the garden was one of the few activities that combined physical movement with the experience of something larger than the walls of a single room. The concubine and her maids might spend an hour or two in the afternoon drifting through these composed landscapes, stopping to admire a flowering tree in season, sitting in a pavilion to watch the koi move lazily through a lotus pool, or simply walking the carefully raked paths in the slow, controlled manner appropriate to a woman of her station. There was a meditative quality to these walks that the best of them seemed to understand intuitively. The garden offered the closest thing to solitude available in a place where solitude in the absolute sense was impossible. Among the rocks and the water, surrounded by her maids, but not required to perform for anyone in particular, a woman could allow her expression to rest, could let her thoughts move more freely than the formal spaces of the palace permitted. Some women used the afternoon for more serious study. Classical texts were available, and literacy was common among palace women who came from educated families. The great historical works of Chinese literature, the poetry of the Tang masters, the philosophical texts of Confucius and his commentators, the rich tradition of Chinese fiction and romance that developed across the dynasties. All of these were things that serious women read and thought about seriously. Books were exchanged between women of compatible intellectual interests. Discussion of texts provided genuine connection and genuine intellectual stimulation in a world that could otherwise become crushing in its sameness. The afternoon was also when certain types of social visiting between women of the inner palace occurred. A concubine of similar rank might send a maid with a message requesting the pleasure of a visit, Tea would be served, conversation would unfold in the careful register of palace speech, never entirely unguarded, but gentler than the calculated exchanges of the more formal hours. Within these visits, friendship happened, real friendship, the kind that develops between people who share an unusual situation and understand one another's world from the inside. These friendships were among the most meaningful relationships available in the inner palace, with family outside the walls and contact severely restricted, with the emperor a figure of distant ceremony more than genuine intimacy for most women. The companionship of other women in similar situations provided something essential, someone to tell things to, someone who understood without explanation, someone whose continued well being mattered in a personal rather than political way. Of course, even friendships in this environment existed within the larger political structure and were never entirely free of it. A close friendship with a woman who subsequently fell from favor could become a liability. A friend whose maid reported private conversations to a senior eunuch could inadvertently expose things that were better kept quiet. Trust was real, but it was also calibrated carefully because it had to be. For the women who had children, the afternoon was often when they spent time with them. Children of the inner palace lived in their own specific world, raised by nurses and tutors, subject to their own regulations about dress and behavior and address. A son who might one day be a prince was educated accordingly from early childhood, the weight of his potential future visible even in how he was taught to sit and speak. A daughter would be raised with the accomplishments and grace that would eventually make her a suitable wife for a nobleman, or, if circumstances aligned, a bride into another imperial house. A mother's time with her child was never uncomplicated. The child belonged to the emperor first, to the dynasty second, and to her in a more limited third place. Yet within those constraints, love was real. The afternoon hours spent watching a small boy practice his calligraphy or listening to a daughter attempt a new melody on the qian were hours that belonged to something genuinely human within the very structured architecture of the day. As afternoon moved toward the later hours, the light in the courtyard changed. The angle of the sun shifted. Long shadows moved across the tiles. The air cooled slightly as it moved toward evening, and the day began its slow turn toward its final phase. It is worth pausing here. In the middle of the day we are tracing through to consider something that ran beneath every hour of the concubine's life, like a current beneath a slow river. Beauty was not simply an attribute she happened to possess. It was her primary asset in a world where assets were everything and most other forms of power were unavailable to her. This meant that the maintenance of beauty was not vanity. It was strategy. It was work. It was a daily investment of time and effort that carried real consequences for the quality and security of her existence. The standards of beauty in Imperial China shifted somewhat across the dynasties, but certain elements remained consistent. Pale skin was universally prized, a sign of indoor living and elevated status. This was actively maintained through the avoidance of sun exposure and the application of various skin preparations. Walking in the garden meant moving in shade when possible, or carrying a parasol. The silk stretched over its frame, catching the light and throwing a cool shadow across carefully preserved complexions. A slender figure was valued, and eating with awareness of this was part of the daily calculation, not the pathological restriction of a later era's concerns, but a conscious relationship with food that kept the body within the ideal proportions that imperial aesthetics favored in a given period. In the Tang dynasty, somewhat fuller figures were considered beautiful, a reflection of that era's confidence and abundance. In other dynasties, the standard tilted thinner. A woman who was paying attention knew which standard applied in her current moment and managed herself accordingly. Hair of great length, blackness, and lustrous quality was prized and carefully maintained. Oils and preparations were worked through the hair regularly. Combing sessions were long and deliberate. Sleep arrangements were managed to minimize damage to hair that had taken so long to arrange. The ornaments that decorated it were not merely decoration, they were themselves expressions of status. The quality of jade in a hairpin communicating rank as clearly as the number of dishes at a meal. The hands were attended to. Nails in certain periods and among higher ranking women were grown long and sometimes sheathed in elaborate nail guards of gold or jade, a visible declaration that these hands did no labor and needed no protection from any task rougher than lifting a tea bowl. Keeping such nails intact through the activities of daily life required constant attention. Hands were moisturized with preparations of various kinds. The skin of the palms was kept smooth. Voice and movement were themselves forms of beauty. The ideal way to walk was with small steps, controlled, fluid, as if the feet barely touched the ground. This was connected to the practice of foot binding that became widespread from the Song dynasty onward. But even before that practice was universal, controlled and graceful movement was a cultivated accomplishment. The voice was modulated toward softness. Speech was measured, never sharp or loud in the presence of those of higher rank. The body itself was trained into a form of beauty that was less about physical attributes and more about the discipline visible in how those attributes were carried. Foot binding deserves its own consideration because it was one of the most significant physical realities of women's lives across a substantial portion of Chinese imperial history. Beginning in the Song dynasty and continuing through the Qing, the practice involved binding the feet of young girls, typically between 4 and 7 years old, with long strips of cloth that prevented the foot from growing normally. The 4 smaller toes were bent under the sole, and the arch was broken so that the foot curled into a compact form idealized in poetry and culture as the golden lotus. The ideal was a foot of about 3 inches in length. The pain involved was severe and extended over years. The initial binding was agonizing. The process of reshaping the foot was slow and accompanied by injury, sometimes infection, sometimes lasting damage that complicated walking for life. Adult women with bound feet walked on the heels and the bent structure below them, moving in the careful, swaying gait that was itself considered graceful and attractive, but which was the product of a body adapting as best it could to permanent structural alteration. A concubine who had bound feet was navigating every moment of her day in this reality. The morning preparations included unwrapping and rewrapping the bindings, washing the feet carefully because skin trapped beneath binding was vulnerable to sores and infection, applying whatever preparations were available to manage the ongoing discomfort. Then the embroidered shoes would go over them, the beautiful exterior concealing the daily management of what lay beneath. That this was considered beautiful, that men found it attractive, that women participated in and perpetuated the practice, is a fact that requires sitting with rather than resolving quickly. It was real. It was part of the world being described here, and for the women who lived within it, it was simply the way things were, neither questioned nor set aside, just managed as another element of the daily effort of maintaining an appearance that might someday mean the difference between a summons and oblivion. Food in the inner palace occupied a position somewhere between sustenance and ceremony. The kitchens that served the imperial household were vast operations involving dozens of specialized cooks, ingredient procurement systems that reached across the empire, and menus that were themselves a form of political statement. What an emperor ate and how it was presented reflected the wealth and order of the state. What his women ate reflected their position within that state. A concubine of middling rank received several dishes at her main meal of the day. The precise number was regulated and known. Exceeding it would be a violation of protocol, though receiving fewer than one's due was also a grievance worth noting. The content of those dishes followed seasonal availability and regional traditions that the imperial kitchen maintained with considerable sophistication. Rice was the foundation of most meals in the southern tradition, or millet and wheat preparations in the northern tradition that the imperial court often reflected as well. Vegetables were prepared in ways that have remained recognizable across centuries, stir-fried with pork fat, braised with aromatics, pickled to preserve and concentrate flavor. Fish and meat appeared according to rank and season, delicate preparations that reflected the refinement of a cuisine that was already ancient and highly developed. The eating ritual itself was performed with formality, sitting correctly, handling chopsticks with the proper grip, not speaking with food in the mouth, not leaning over the dishes in a way that suggested hunger or haste. Even alone with only her maids present, a woman of the inner palace maintained these forms, because the forms were what she was, not a performance for an audience, but a way of existing that had become indistinguishable from identity. Tea was consumed throughout the day, but the tea of the evening meal was often more considered. Certain teas were appropriate for certain times and moods. The palate for tea in imperial China was educated and discriminating. The subtle differences between teas from different mountains or different harvest times appreciated with the same seriousness that might be given to other aesthetic pleasures. The vessels in which tea was served communicated taste and status. A woman whose tea bowl was a particularly fine piece of Song Dynasty celadon was making a statement about her refinement every time she lifted it. Evenings when a formal gathering was held were different from the quiet private meals. Seasonal festivals brought women of the inner palace together for banquets and performances, seated in order of rank, served in order of rank, and expected to behave in ways that reflected well on the emperor's household and on themselves. These occasions were opportunities, a chance to be seen by more eyes than the usual daily routine provided, a chance to demonstrate one's accomplishments if music or poetry was part of the evening's program. Musicians and performers were brought in for major occasions, or the women themselves provided music and sometimes dance. The preparation for such an evening began much earlier in the day, the hair arranged with special care, the robes selected from the best of what was available, the makeup applied with extra attention. Then hours of sitting in the correct posture, eating the correct amount, smiling at the correct moments, all while managing whatever complex internal weather the evening's specific political climate had generated. After the formal meal was concluded and the gathering dissolved, women returned to their own quarters. The evening hours wound down. Candles burned in their holders. The sounds of the palace at night were different from the sounds of the day. Fewer voices, the distant movement of the night watch, the soft sounds of wind through the gardens. This was when some women wrote. The evening and the privacy of the late hours were the time for the most honest creative work. Poetry composed at night had a different quality than poetry composed in the formal afternoon, less concerned with demonstration, more interested in actual feeling. Some of these private writings survived. Some were destroyed by the women themselves before they could be read by eyes they hadn't intended. Some were preserved by luck or by the care of maids who understood that what their mistress had written was worth keeping. The most celebrated of these evening writings from women of the inner palace are remarkable documents. They speak of longing, of boredom, of beauty that feels like a cage, of connection with other women that sustains the spirit, even as the larger situation continues to constrain it. They are not uniformly tragic because the women who wrote them were not uniformly tragic. They were complicated people who found complicated ways to live within difficult circumstances and occasionally found genuine joy in the process. No account of life as a concubine in ancient China would be honest if it did not look directly at the politics, because the inner palace was not a peaceful place. It was beautiful. It was structured. It was governed by elaborate rules of conduct. And beneath all of that, it was a site of fierce competition for resources that were severely limited and unevenly distributed. The most valuable resource was the emperor's favor, and the emperor's favor produced all the other resources that mattered: better quarters, more servants, higher rank, the possibility of bearing a child, the possibility of that child's succession. Every woman in the inner palace understood this arithmetic, and almost every woman acted on it in some way. The competition was rarely expressed in the direct confrontation that dramatic depictions in modern media have made familiar. Open conflict was dangerous and usually self-defeating. A woman who made scenes, who shouted, who attacked a rival openly, disqualified herself through her lack of composure. The emperor wanted harmony in his household. Disrupting it was a serious violation that could result in punishment, demotion, or worse. So the competition moved underground. It operated through rumor and implication, through the careful management of who said what to which eunuch, through the strategic timing of gifts and appearances, through the cultivation of allies among the women and the staff who collectively controlled information flow throughout the palace. Accusations of witchcraft were one of the more dramatic tools available. In a world where the supernatural was taken seriously and where misfortune required explanation, accusing a rival of using magic to harm the emperor or to secure unnatural influence over him was a weapon that could be deployed with devastating effect. If such an accusation gained traction, if a eunuch or a serving woman could be found to corroborate it, the consequences for the accused could be catastrophic: exile, punishment, in the most severe cases, death. The history of the inner palace records many such accusations. Not all of them were false. The desperation of the environment was real, and some women did resort to practices that included the burning of charms or the bearing of talismans beneath the thresholds of rivals' quarters, things that could be presented as evidence of malevolent magic if discovered. Others were entirely false accusations deployed cynically against women who had done nothing but attract a little too much attention at the wrong moment. Children were both the prize and the vulnerability of this system. A woman who bore a son achieved a form of security that nothing else could fully provide. But her son was also a target. Rivals who could not advance their own son's prospects might seek to undermine hers. The court history of every dynasty included episodes of infant mortality that contemporaries viewed with suspicion. The death of a potential heir under circumstances that suggested something other than natural causes. Poison was a fear that ran through the inner palace like a quiet current. Food preparation was monitored. Silver chopsticks were used because silver was believed to discolor in contact with certain poisons, a test whose actual chemistry was questionable, but whose psychological function was clear. Trusted serving women were stationed at every step of the food preparation and delivery process. A concubine of any significance thought carefully about where her food came from and who had touched it before it reached her table. The eunuchs were indispensable to all of this, and also the greatest potential source of vulnerability within it. A eunuch who had been cultivated carefully over years and given sufficient gifts and treated with sufficient respect could be a loyal and effective ally. The same eunuch, if neglected or offended or offered better terms by a rival, could become the vehicle through which damaging information traveled to precisely the ears it was most dangerous to reach. Managing the eunuchs required its own kind of intelligence. They were not simply servants, they were sophisticated political actors in their own right who understood the inner palace and its dynamics at a granular level that exceeded that of many of the women they served. The most powerful eunuchs in certain dynasties wielded influence that reached far beyond the inner court, shaping administrative decisions and imperial policy through their proximity to the emperor in ways that made them de facto powers. A concubine who understood how to work with these figures, rather than simply issuing orders to them, had a significant advantage over one who did not. And then there were the rivalries between factions of women allied to different potential successors. As an emperor aged and the question of succession became more pressing, the inner court divided along lines that followed the interests of different sons and therefore the mothers of those sons. These factional alignments shaped everything. Which women were invited to sit were at formal gatherings, which requests received favorable consideration from senior administrators, who the emperor listened to when he had occasion to listen at all. A woman who had navigated all of this successfully for decades, was someone of remarkable capability, someone who had survived through intelligence and patience and the careful management of an extraordinarily complex social environment. That history rarely recognized this kind of intelligence, as the significant achievement it was reflects more about the values of the historians than about the actual difficulty of the achievement. Of all the events that could change a concubine's life, pregnancy was the most transformative. The moment a woman believed she might be with child, everything changed. The announcement of a suspected pregnancy had to be handled carefully. It was reported to the appropriate palace officials who maintained records of such things with meticulous care, because the paternity of any child born within the inner palace had to be traceable and unimpeachable. The timing was documented, the circumstances were noted, the relevant eunuchs made their reports. If the pregnancy was confirmed, the concubine's status elevated immediately. Better food appeared at her table, more servants attended her, her quarters might be upgraded. The protective attention of the court turned toward her and toward the life she was carrying. The care of a pregnant concubine was both genuine and strategic. Palace physicians, men who were among the most skilled practitioners of their time, attended her regularly. Traditional Chinese medicine's understanding of pregnancy was sophisticated in its own terms, focused on the balance of energies in the body, the management of diet and activity, the avoidance of physical and emotional shocks. Certain foods were prescribed, certain activities were restricted. Rest was mandated in ways that the regular rhythm of her life had never afforded. The emotional dimension of pregnancy in this environment was complex. Joy was real, the possibility of a son, the possibility of a future, the possibility of finally having something that was undeniably hers in this world, that had given her so little that could truly be called her own. These were profound. At the same time, anxiety was real too. Rivals understood what her pregnancy meant. The careful attention she received now included the possibility of harm from those who would benefit from the pregnancy failing. Food was monitored even more carefully. Her most trusted women never left her side. The birth itself was attended by palace midwives and physicians, a formal occasion surrounded by ceremony and oversight. The moment a child emerged and its sex was determined, the world shifted. A daughter was welcome. She would be raised within the palace or eventually married outward into a noble family, providing connection and alliance. But a son was a different kind of arrival entirely. A son was the future made tangible. The infant was taken almost immediately into the care of palace nurses. This was standard practice, and one of the elements of palace life that the historical record suggests women found genuinely painful. A mother might spend time with her child daily, might nurse the infant if she was allowed to and wished to, but the primary care was delegated to specialists. The child's upbringing was too important to be left entirely to maternal instinct. It was managed by the court. As the son grew, his mother's position grew with him. If he attracted the emperor's favorable attention and was named crown prince, she became one of the most powerful figures in the inner palace. If he ascended to the throne upon the emperor's death, she would become Empress Dowager, a position of formal authority that in some dynasties translated into actual governance. Several of the most consequential rulers of Chinese history were women who had entered the palace as concubines and reached this summit through the trajectory of their sons' fortunes. But these outcomes were the exception. Most children of the inner palace lived quieter lives. Most sons of emperors did not become emperor. They were ennobled and established in households of their own, their mother's fates moving with them out of the inner palace in some cases, or remaining behind in others, as the mother aged into a role of honored but increasingly marginal existence. The loss of a child was among the most devastating events possible in this world. High infant and child mortality rates were the reality of life in virtually every pre modern society, regardless of wealth. The inner palace, with its sophisticated medical care, offered some protection, but children still died of illness, of epidemic, of causes that no amount of attention could prevent. A mother who had invested her hopes in a son and lost him returned to a position of stark vulnerability. She was once again simply a concubine without the one thing that had given her real consequence. The grief was real, and the political reversal was immediate. One of the aspects of concubine life in ancient China that most challenges assumptions formed by other historical contexts is the emphasis placed on education and literary accomplishment. In many cultures and many historical periods, women's literacy was actively suppressed or simply never developed because the resources to develop it were never extended in that direction. Imperial China was not uniformly progressive on questions of gender by any means. But within the inner palace specifically, literacy and literary accomplishment were not just permitted, they were expected and valued. The reasoning was partly practical. A woman who would spend significant time in the company of a man of culture and education, a man who read classical texts and wrote poetry and engaged in philosophical discussion, needed to be able to participate in those conversations at some level. An entirely silent companion whose only resource was physical beauty offered less than one who could respond intelligently to a line of poetry or who had her own aesthetic opinions about calligraphy or painting. The reasoning was also partly about the management of the inner court itself. The senior women who oversaw the inner palace had administrative responsibilities that required reading and writing. Records had to be kept. Correspondence had to be managed. A woman who could not read could not advance to the positions where these responsibilities lived. And beyond the practical, there was the genuine cultural value placed on learning in the Confucian tradition that underpinned imperial Chinese society. A person of cultivation was a better person in ways that were considered real and significant. The accomplishments of calligraphy and poetry and music were expressions of an inner refinement that was genuinely admired. Women who demonstrated these accomplishments were respected for them in ways that went beyond their utility in attracting the emperor's attention. What this meant in practice was that many women who entered the inner palace already possessed some level of education, and that once inside, they had both the resources and the time to continue developing it. Books were available, teachers could be summoned. The long, quiet hours of the inner palace were hours that could be filled with genuine learning if a woman chose to use them that way. Some of the most interesting literary voices to emerge from the courts of China's dynasties were women writing from within the inner palace. Their poetry is remarkable for what it reveals about the actual texture of their days, the light on a particular afternoon, the sound of rain on the roof tiles, the emotional complexity of a situation that could not be spoken about directly, and therefore had to be approached through image and metaphor and the careful deployment of classical illusion. The tradition of gong chi, palace poetry, written by women of the inner court, stretches across many dynasties and contains some of the most psychologically observant writing in the classical tradition. These poems circulated within the palace and sometimes beyond it. They were copied and discussed. They were influential. The women who wrote them were taken seriously as poets. This was not universal. Not every woman who entered the palace was literate, or became so. Not every literate woman found in poetry the means of expression that suited her. Some women's intelligence operated entirely in the practical and social rather than the literary. Some women found more meaning in music than in writing. The inner palace was not a monolithic experience any more than any other confined community is monolithic, but the possibility of a genuine inner life, of intellectual engagement and creative expression, and the development of real skill in things that mattered beyond their instrumental value. This possibility was real, and many women within the inner palace availed themselves of it in ways that gave their circumscribed existence a depth and meaning that simple descriptions of the hierarchy and the waiting and the politics might not suggest. The tension between the constraints and the possibilities was the essential tension of the concubine's existence. She had less freedom than almost any person outside the palace. She had more access to education and culture and aesthetic experience than almost any woman of her era. She was at once profoundly unfree and possessed of resources for inner life that most people never encountered. Living within that tension was the actual work of being who she was. There is a poem from the Tang dynasty that has survived 1,200 years and still carries its particular weight clearly enough to be felt across the distance. It was written by a woman of the inner palace. Her name, as with so many of these writers, is uncertain. She may have given her name. It may have been lost. The poem survived her name. In it, she describes the view from her window in autumn, the leaves turning on the trees she can see from the courtyard, and the sounds of the city beyond the wall that she can hear but not see and cannot reach. She does not describe her situation as unjust. She does not ask for anything. She simply describes, with perfect precision, what the view looks like and what the sounds suggest about the world, continuing its life without her. The restraint of it is the most devastating thing about it. This is what longing looked like in the inner palace. Not explosive, not dramatic, exact and quiet, and embedded in the observation of small things. Longing was the emotional weather of the inner palace in a way that no other feeling quite matched. Not unhappiness exactly, because unhappiness implies a contrast with an expected happiness that has been denied. Longing was something more settled than that. It was the continuous awareness of absence, the awareness of the family aging outside the walls, the awareness of the world moving forward through seasons and events that could be heard sometimes, but not participated in, the awareness of a life that might have been different if the variables had arranged themselves differently at the start. The women who were literate processed this longing through writing. The ones who were musical processed it through the particular quality that appears in certain kinds of playing, a careful attention to the sustain of a note before it fades, a lingering on transitions, the musical equivalent of not wanting to let go of something. The ones who were visual in their sensibilities processed it through the specific images they chose to paint and embroider: the migrating bird, the distant mountain, the single flower past its peak but not yet fallen. These were not accidental choices of subject matter. They were the vocabulary of an emotional life that could not be expressed directly, and therefore found its expression in the ancient and sophisticated symbolic language that classical Chinese culture had developed over centuries precisely for situations where direct expression was either impossible or inadequate. Contact with family was one of the most painfully regulated aspects of inner palace life. In principle, it existed. In practice, it was carefully controlled and often infrequent. A family member who wished to visit had to navigate the formal request procedures, had to be approved, had to come at times and under conditions set by the palace administration. The visit itself took place in designated reception rooms, not in the concubine's private quarters, and was observed or at least potentially observable. It was not the visit of a daughter returning home, but of a formal exchange between the world inside and the world outside, with all the awkwardness that implies. Letters could be sent and received, but were also subject to scrutiny. A woman who wished to communicate something genuinely personal to a family member had to encode it within the formal conventions of letter writing that could be read by intermediate eyes without obvious cause for concern. This art of saying one thing while meaning another developed into genuine sophistication among women who maintained it over years. The question of whether to feel hope or to release it was one that every woman in the inner palace eventually confronted. Hope for the summons, hope for the elevation of rank, hope for the pregnancy, hope for the son, hope that the son would succeed. There was a logic to maintaining hope because the structure of the situation technically permitted these outcomes, and occasionally they happened. But hope in a context where its realization depended almost entirely on factors beyond one's control had its own costs. The maintenance of hope required a constant expenditure of attention and energy. It kept the mind oriented toward a future that might not arrive. It made the present moment feel like a waiting room rather than a life being lived. Some women made a different choice at some point in their tenure. They redirected attention from the future to the present, from the hope of summons to the quality of this afternoon's music practice, from the calculation of advancement to the genuine pleasure of a poem well composed, from the management of positioning to the warmth of a particular friendship. This was not resignation in the negative sense. It was a form of wisdom that the circumstances encouraged. The Buddhist practices that many women adopted supported this reorientation. The present moment was the only moment available. The past was fixed, and the future was uncertain, and the only life actually happening was the one in this breath, and this hour, and this conversation. For a woman whose capacity to act on the future was severely restricted, this teaching had particular practical relevance. Sitting in meditation in the early morning while the palace was still quiet, was not just spiritual practice, it was a way of inhabiting time that made the quality of each hour matter in itself rather than only as a step towards something else. And this quality of presence, this developed capacity to be genuinely in the moment that was actually happening, was perhaps one of the more unexpected gifts that the constrained life of the inner palace occasionally offered. Not to everyone, not always, but to those who found their way to it through whatever path was available to them. A life lived with extraordinary attention to small things, to the quality of light at a particular time of day, to the exact sound a particular instrument makes in a particular room, to the specific texture of a friendship built over years in a shared and unusual situation, is not without its own kind of richness. It is simply a richness that requires the abandonment of the more conventional kinds of freedom to become visible. The year in the inner palace moved through its seasons with the same rhythm that the year always moves through them everywhere. But the seasons inside the walls had their own specific character, their own particular meanings, their own relationship to the emotional and social life of the women who experienced them there. Spring came with particular force in the inner palace gardens. The plum blossoms that bloomed even in late cold, white and pink against branches still bare of leaves, were among the most celebrated and symbolic flowers in the Chinese aesthetic tradition. Their arrival was an event. Women who could find a reason to be near the plum trees in the early morning when the blossoms were freshest would do so. Their fleeting beauty was the subject of poems composed by women in the inner court over centuries. The brief perfection of the blossom and its quick falling understood as a comment on something more general about beauty and time that was not lost on the writers. After the plum came the cherry and the peach, and then the peonies that were perhaps the most lavishly praised flowers of the classical tradition. Peonies in full bloom were a spectacle that even the inner palace, with all its beauty, treated as special. Their heavy, extravagant flowers in shades of pink and red and white represented a kind of abundance that was its own statement about the season. Women gathered near the peonies when they were at their peak. The images they produced in embroidery and painting during these weeks had a different quality than the winter work, looser perhaps, more saturated in color, carrying something of the season's own energy. Summer in the inner palace was managed through architecture and habit. The buildings were designed with ventilation in mind, high ceilings, and carefully positioned openings, allowing air to move through in ways that kept the worst of the heat at bay. Thin silk replaced the heavier winter robes. The pace of the day shifted somewhat, the hottest midday hours spent in the coolest available spaces, rather than in active movement through the corridors. Lotus flowers on the palace ponds reached their peak in summer, their large pale blooms opened to the morning light and then closed again by afternoon. The lotus was among the most significant symbols in Buddhist iconography and also one of the most celebrated in purely aesthetic terms. The quality of its floating on water, while rooted in the mud below a metaphor that the inner palace offered unusual space to contemplate. Autumn brought the chrysanthemums, and with them the double ninth festival when chrysanthemum wine was drunk and the season's change was formally acknowledged. The cooling air after the long summer was itself a pleasure. The days shortened. The leaves on the trees planted throughout the palace gardens turned the gold and red that had inspired so many of the poems being considered here. There was a bittersweet quality to autumn in the inner palace that matched the season's bittersweet quality everywhere. The beauty of the change inseparable from the knowledge of the cold ahead. Winter was the hardest season. The beautiful gardens turned bare. The outdoor spaces that had offered movement and the experience of something larger than the rooms became cold and less hospitable. Life contracted further toward the interior, toward the fire braziers that heated the inner chambers, toward heavier silk and the closer company of the serving women and whatever female neighbors were on visiting terms. The long winter evenings were the longest of the year, and the darkness outside the window the most complete. Festivals punctuated the year and provided some of the inner palace's most structured social occasions. The Lunar New Year was the largest and most elaborate, a period of days rather than a single day, involving ceremony and feasting and performances and the full formal display of the court's hierarchy. The preparations began weeks in advance. The costuming involved was more elaborate than the already elaborate daily standard. The food was more numerous in courses and more carefully prepared. The occasions for being seen by the emperor and the rest of the court were more numerous. These festival periods were both anticipated and exhausting. The social performance required was more sustained and more visible than the ordinary days demanded. The calculations about positioning and expression and the management of rivals were conducted at higher intensity, but they also provided genuine variety and genuine spectacle, color and music and movement, and the sense of being part of something larger than the daily routine. The Mid-Autumn Festival brought its own particular atmosphere. The full moon of the 8th lunar month was the occasion for gathering to view the moon, for eating moon cakes and drinking rice wine and reciting poetry. The moon had associations with longing and separation in the Chinese poetic tradition that made the festival specifically resonant for women in the inner palace. The same moon visible from within the walls was visible outside them too. A mother knowing that her own mother was looking at the same moon from a courtyard on the other side of those walls. The shared object creating a fragile thread of connection across the distance. This was one of the most common images in the poetry of palace women. The moon as the thing that crossed the wall that no person could cross. The repetition of these seasons, year after year, created its own relationship with time. A woman who had seen 20 springs from within the same walls had a different relationship to the plum blossoms than she had at her first one. The first spring was full of the newness of it all, the beauty of the garden seen with recently arrived eyes, everything still strange and overwhelming and not yet fully understood. By the 20th spring, the blossoms arrived in the context of 19 previous arrivals, each one layered over the others, the beauty of this year's flowers inseparable from the memory of all the previous ones. Time accumulated inside the inner palace in a way that gave even the recurring things a depth and weight that single encounters could not carry. This accumulation was its own form of wealth, a kind that could not be taken away, a kind that lived entirely inside the person who had experienced it, and that no change in rank or fortune or summons could diminish. The woman who had paid attention for decades to the specific quality of autumn light in the Imperial gardens owned something permanent. It was not the kind of ownership the world outside the walls would have recognized or valued, but it was real. As evening settled over the inner palace and the last light left the sky above the courtyards, the pace of the day changed once more. The great busyness of the morning and the meditative stretch of the afternoon gave way to the quieter, more intimate quality of night. Lanterns were lit in the corridors. The soft glow of candles appeared in the windows of the individual quarters. The night watch moved through their routes with the regularity of years, their footsteps on the stone paths becoming part of the palace's nighttime soundtrack. For most women on most evenings, night meant returning to the private world of their own quarters. The serving women helped with the evening routine, unwinding the hair from its elaborate arrangement, removing the outer robes, wiping the cosmetics from the face with soft cloths, and the same rice water preparations used in the morning. The face that emerged from this process was different from the face that had gone through the day, unmarked by the careful performance of the hours, simply itself in the dim light of the room. There was something in this removal of the day's face that carried its own emotional weight. The woman who sat at the end of the evening with her hair down and her skin bare was in some sense more herself than the woman who had spent the day in full presentation. These private moments, watched only by maids who had been with her long enough that their presence barely registered as external, were as close to rest as the inner palace allowed before sleep. Some women read in the late evening. The quietness of the room and the softness of the candlelight made reading feel different than it did during the day, more absorbing, more personal. A poem read at midnight had a resonance it didn't have at noon. The classical texts that dealt with separation and longing and the passing of time hit differently when the palace was quiet and the only sound was the distant drip of water from a garden fountain. Some wrote, "The evening was the time for the most private creative work. A woman composing poetry at night was under less pressure to produce something presentable. She could write toward her actual feelings rather than toward an appropriate demonstration of her feelings. These were often the pieces worth keeping. Some sat and simply existed, not reading and not writing, not practicing an instrument, just sitting with the particular weight of what her life was, thinking whatever thoughts came, feeling whatever feelings were available to her. The simple act of sitting quietly without a task was itself a form of rest that the busy performance of the day rarely allowed. Sleep, when it came, was not always easy. The concerns of the inner palace did not stop for the night. A woman who had been on the receiving end of a hostile look from a senior consort that morning found herself replaying it in the dark, calculating what it might mean and what the appropriate response might be. A woman who had heard a rumor that the emperor had summoned a particular rival 3 nights in succession was doing her own quiet arithmetic about the implications. But eventually, the exhaustion of the performance of the day claimed its due. The body that had been carefully arranged since before dawn, that had walked correctly and spoken correctly and managed its expression correctly through every formal interaction, needed to stop. And in the close and relatively private space of the sleeping room, it could. The bed itself was one of the genuine luxuries of palace life. Heavy silk curtains closed around it, creating a smaller space within the room, warmer, darker, more enclosed. The silk coverings were cool against the skin initially, and then warmed quickly. The pillow was often ceramic rather than soft, a practice that protected the elaborate hairstyle, even in sleep, though by the time the hair was down for the night, this mattered less. The mattress stuffed with silk floss was incomparably softer than what the vast majority of the world slept on, and in this all enclosed space, the day's performance finally ended. There were no more eyes watching, no more calculations to make, no more careful management of expression and tone and positioning. Just the ordinary animal fact of a body that needed rest, finding the dark and the quiet that would give it. Sleep came in its own time, some nights quickly, the exhaustion too complete to permit delay, other nights more slowly, the mind unwilling to release its grip on the day's events and their implications. But it came, and while she slept, the palace continued its nighttime life around her. The night watch made their rounds. The kitchens that never fully rested began their preparations for the next day's meals. In some part of the vast complex, the emperor might be awake, attended by his own servants, reading a report from a distant province, or simply sitting with the particular weight of his own office. And somewhere in another quarter, another woman might be lying awake, doing the same calculations that the one we have been following had finally surrendered to sleep. The palace breathed through the night, enormous, beautiful, contained, the world inside it turning on its own axis, its own hierarchies and dramas and quiet moments, while the world outside continued its completely separate life beyond the walls. Time passed differently inside the inner palace than it did outside. Outside the walls, people aged in relation to the events of their lives. They measured time by the growth of their children, by harvests good and poor, by the building and losing of things. Life outside was structured by change. Inside the inner palace, time passed in repetition, the same routines, the same rituals, the same corridors and courtyards, the same faces year after year. Change happened, but it was often subtle, a shift in hierarchy when a rival fell, a new woman entering and disrupting the established order slightly, a child growing out of infancy and into something more distinct. But the essential shape of the days remained recognizable from year to year in a way that life outside rarely permitted. And in this context, aging was a particular kind of experience. A concubine who entered the palace at 14 or 15 and was now 25 had lived a decade of this existence, a decade of the same routines, a decade of managing the same politics, a decade of waiting and hoping and calculating, and sometimes finding genuine meaning, and sometimes not. She had aged in experience in ways that her contemporaries outside the walls had aged through an entirely different set of experiences. Her physical appearance was something she had invested enormous effort in maintaining. The skincare preparations, the careful management of diet, the avoidance of sun, the protection of hands, all of this had purpose that extended beyond mere vanity into the real calculation of survival. But the body aged regardless. The face that had turned the emperor's eye at 15 or 16 did not remain exactly what it had been. Fine lines appeared. The quality of the skin changed gradually. Hair began, for some, to show the first threads of white earlier than it would have outside, the stress of the environment contributing in ways that manifested physically. As a concubine moved through her 20s and into her 30s, the prospect of summons that had been a realistic hope in her youth became something she thought about differently. The emperor's attention moved toward newer arrivals. The mathematical reality of a household with many women and an emperor whose tastes were as human as anyone else's meant that novelty had its own appeal. Women who had been inside the palace for years were the familiar, the known, and the known competed at a disadvantage against the newly arrived. This was not universal. Some women retained the emperor's interest and affection through personality and intelligence and accumulated intimacy across years. A woman who had genuinely charmed him, who had made him laugh or shown him something unexpected about herself, who had been a real companion rather than merely a beautiful presence, could maintain a place in his attention that newer arrivals did not easily displace. But these relationships were the exception. For most women, middle age in the inner palace brought a shift toward the slower occupation of the senior quarters. Women who had been in the palace for many years without bearing surviving heirs or without having achieved high rank occupied a specific social position. They were neither the competitive young arrivals working every angle available to be noticed, nor the powerful senior consorts managing the court's business. They were the middle ground, experienced, politically sophisticated, relatively stable in their positions because they posed no significant threat and offered no significant prize. Some women found this stability genuinely comfortable in a way the anxious years of active competition had not been. The exhausting vigilance of the early years, the constant calculation of every interaction, could be released somewhat when the competition was effectively over and nothing much depended on tonight's expression or tomorrow's positioning. A woman in her 40s who had survived in the inner palace for decades had done something genuinely difficult. She knew the place completely. She knew its rhythms and its characters and its history. Within the terms of the world she inhabited, she had expertise. The relationships among women of similar position and similar age were often the richest relationships the inner palace offered. Women who had moved through the same decades together, who had watched each other's children born and sometimes die, who had navigated the same politics from positions that had been sometimes allied and sometimes opposed, carried a quality of mutual understanding that was among the rarest things available in this environment. They had history together, and history between people who share a difficult situation creates a kind of bond that is hard to replicate. Religious practice was another resource that became more important as years passed. Buddhism was widely practiced throughout much of the period of Chinese imperial history. The inner palace had its own shrines and small temples. Some women whose practical engagement with the world of summons and competition was behind them turned increasingly toward religious practice as the structure that gave their days meaning. Meditation, the repetition of sutras, the quiet ritual of maintaining a shrine. These practices offered a kind of peace that the outer world of palace politics could not. Older women also often became informal advisors to younger arrivals. A woman who had survived and understood the inner palace could offer something valuable to a young girl just arriving, overwhelmed, frightened, trying to understand the rules of a world nothing in her previous life had prepared her for. Not all senior women extended this kind of mentorship generously. Some preserved their knowledge as advantage and saw no reason to share it, but others found genuine satisfaction in helping younger women navigate what they themselves had once found so difficult. In a world that offered limited forms of meaningful contribution, this was one. The question of what happened when the emperor died is one of the most significant in any account of concubine life. An emperor's death ended the period of his reign and began a new one under his successor. For the women of the inner palace, this transition was among the most consequential events possible, and the answer to what happened to them varied significantly across dynasties, across individual emperors and their successors, and across the specific circumstances of each woman's position. In some of the earliest periods of Chinese history, the practice of burying women along with a deceased ruler existed. Archaeological evidence from the Shang dynasty, thousands of years before the period most commonly associated with Imperial China's concubine system, reveals graves of royalty accompanied by sacrificed human beings, including women who had been part of the household. This practice declined and eventually ended as Chinese civilization developed different values around death and the afterlife, but its historical existence is part of the longer story. In later periods, and through most of the dynasties most associated with the concubine system, the practice that applied to the majority of palace women was not death but withdrawal. Upon the emperor's death, his women who had not borne children or whose children were not the new emperor were typically required to withdraw from the active inner palace into a more restricted life within the palace complex or in a palace monastery. They would wear mourning, they would observe the formal rituals of grief, and then they would settle into what was essentially a retirement from the life they had been living. A woman in this situation occupied an unusual position. She was not free to leave. She was not free to remarry. She was not free to return to family life or to seek a new existence outside the walls. She had belonged to the emperor, and in death that belonging continued in the sense that she was still part of the imperial household and still subject to its regulations. But the center of energy had moved on. The new emperor had his own household, his own women, his own politics to manage. The women of his predecessor's inner court were peripheral to all of this. Those whose sons had become the new emperor occupied an entirely different position. The Empress Dowager, the mother of the reigning emperor, could be one of the most powerful figures in the realm. If the new emperor was young, if he had ascended before reaching full maturity, his mother might effectively govern through him. The history of Imperial China included several women who wielded this power with considerable effectiveness. Wu Zetian in the Tang dynasty stands as the most dramatic example, eventually ruling in her own name as emperor. Cixi in the Qing dynasty ruled as regent through two successive emperors and shaped the last decades of imperial China in ways still debated by historians. But for most women, the death of the emperor brought the quieter ending of a life that contracted further still. The already restricted world of the inner palace narrowed to the women's quarters of a grieving court. The routines continued, but stripped of whatever future orientation they had once carried. There was no longer a summons to wait for. The calculations about positioning and favor lost their point. What remained was the community of the women themselves, the religious practice, the quiet occupation of the days, and whatever interior resources each individual had developed over the years of her life within these walls. Some women found genuine peace in this phase. The competition was over. The performance could be released. The relationships that had survived the years of political maneuvering could settle into something more purely personal. Days shaped by simple routine and religious practice and the company of women who understood one another completely. This was not the life most of them would have chosen, but within what was available, it could be a life with its own quiet dignity. Death itself came eventually, as it comes to everyone. Palace women were buried with appropriate ceremony, the detail of which depended on their rank and on whether they had sons to oversee the arrangements. Their graves were marked, their tablets were placed in the appropriate ancestral shrines. Their names were recorded in the official genealogical documents of the dynasty. And then, in most cases, they were quietly forgotten. History moved on to the next dynasty. The great records focused on the emperors, on the prime ministers, on the military campaigns and the administrative achievements and the philosophical developments. The women who had spent their lives navigating the inner palace, who had managed extraordinary social complexity with great skill, who had created music and poetry and beautiful embroidery and raised children whose names history did remember. Most of these women simply dissolved back into the background of the past from which individual lives are rarely recovered. It is one of the quiet injustices of the historical record. Not the greatest injustice produced by these centuries, but a real one. The intelligence and the endurance required to live the life we have been tracing through these hours were genuine. The inner life that sustained it was genuine. The love and grief and aspiration and occasional joy were genuine. They happened. They were real. We simply have to work harder to find them. And so we find ourselves at the end of another long, quiet evening together. We have moved through an entire life, from the first day behind the gates of the inner palace, through the long years of routine and politics and waiting and occasional grace, to the quieter end of an existence that most of history never thought worth recording in detail. If you are still with me, I hope the hours have passed gently. If you drifted off somewhere in the middle, perhaps somewhere in the gardens of the afternoon, or while the candles were burning low in the evening quarters, that is exactly what this is for. The story will still be here when you return. There is something worth carrying gently into sleep, if you are heading there now. The woman we followed tonight navigated a world of extraordinary constraint with extraordinary intelligence. She found music and poetry and friendship and meaning within walls that most of us would have found unbearable. She endured. She adapted. She discovered within the space available to her the resources that made that space livable. That is not a small thing. It is perhaps the most human thing. As you settle now into your own rest, in whatever corner of the world you are in tonight, let the images soften, the silk robes, the lantern light across the courtyard tiles, the sound of a chin drifting from somewhere beyond the garden wall, the smell of incense in a small palace shrine, the low voices of women talking in the evening, Let all of it drift quietly away, like the smoke of a candle just extinguished, faint and curling, and then gone. There is nothing you need to do right now. No tasks waiting, no calculations to make, no positioning to manage. Just this moment, this stillness, this gentle permission to let the day go. If sleep has already begun, that is perfectly all right. If you are still just at the edge of it, let these last words carry you the rest of the way. When you wake from sleep or from wherever this took you, please leave a soft comment telling me where you listened from tonight and what time it was there. It is one of the small, quiet pleasures of making these, knowing that so many people in so many different places found their way to the same calm hours together. Thank you for spending this evening with Drowsy History. Rest well wherever you are until the next quiet evening.